Next, we'll look at several different ways that you can bind to the style attribute. Vue treats these types of bindings a little differently in order to help us manage them more efficiently, as you'll see. In the exercise files in the Chapter 1 Video 7 Start folder, you'll find style.html with a shell of a Vue app that should be familiar by now. The first thing I want to do is just create a div and show you how you can bind to the style attribute with :style. Remember, that's short for vbind::style. And we can give it a JavaScript object with some normal CSS property names like border. But for something like margin-bottom, which isn't a valid property name in JavaScript, you'll want to use quotes. Or you could also use the corresponding camel case name instead. So I'll do that for font size, which would normally be font-size in plain CSS. Also, just like with any other type of bound attribute, I can use properties from my data object. For instance, if I had a property called myFontSize with a value of 24, I could use that up here and then add px. So let's close this div, and then I'm just going to add a note here that this is a JavaScript object literal bound to style attribute. So let's take a look. So you can see that CSS is applied to that div. We can also just put all of the CSS properties that we want into an object inside data and bind that entire object to the style attribute. So for example, I'll create an object called fancyDiv in data like so. So I'm using the camel case names for background color and border radius. We'll give it a little bit of padding and the margin on the top so that it's not squished up against the first div. So now I can do :style and use fancyDiv for the style binding value. No curly braces necessary this time since fancyDiv is already an object. So this is also an object literal bound to the style attribute, but it comes from data. Finally, let's look at one last way we can use style bindings, and that's with an array of style objects. For example, I can create another div, and this time bind to style an array that includes both fancyDiv and another object that I'll call fancierDiv, which I'll also have to add to data. So fancierDiv is going to have a fancier font, a border, and increased padding. So notice that they both include a padding property, but as you can see when I refresh this, that the two objects will be merged and the second object's properties will override the properties of the first object. So only the padding of 30 pixels shows up in this element style. Now let's use what we've learned about event handling to add an effect to this last div when we mouse over and mouse out. We're going to change some properties of fancierDiv, and as long as those properties are declared initially, for reasons we'll discuss soon, we can update them at runtime in response to an event. So I'll use the shorthand for @mouseover and @mouseout. So @mouseover. And for example, I might update the border property like this. And for mouse out, I'll just set it back to its initial value. So now when I refresh, you can see that style is being updated accordingly. Another interactive effect I can achieve without event handling is to allow the font size up here to be changed dynamically based on the value of a number input that uses vModel to bind to my font size. So you could probably imagine using this technique to build a nice widget for users to adjust the font size on your site. If you find these techniques useful, that's great. But if you can accomplish what you need to do using the class attribute, that's sometimes a little bit cleaner. So let's take a look at how that works next.